With the race for the White House heating up, the Republican presidential field is getting bigger and bigger. Meanwhile, the Democratic primary is not as large, with a select few candidates taking on President Joe Biden. Joining me for a deep dive into her 2024 candidacy and platform is one of President Biden's challengers in the 2024 election, author Marianne Williamson. Marianne, thank you for being here, especially on the eve of you becoming a grandmother.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, let's start by talking about the recent indictment of former President Trump. Your campaign released a statement regarding the indictment of former President Trump of 37 felony counts related to his alleged mishandling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. The statement said, quote, "The law should never be an instrument of personal grievance." Do you think the recent indictment of the former president was at all politically motivated?
No, I think Jack Smith is an independent counsel. This man worked at The Hague. He is not an instrument of the Biden administration. I think he chose prosecution because the evidence led him to that. And let's remember, a grand jury indicted the president. So we haven't heard what Robert Hur says, but I think that we need to remember that the criminal justice system should be completely separate from politics. And all of us, no matter what our politics, should just be hoping for a fair trial for anyone, for any American. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and everyone must be treated equally before the law. That should apply to someone if they're a former president, current president, or anyone else.
Do you think there's any reason to not have faith in the current criminal justice system?
If you're poor or Black, absolutely. But, on the level of what we're talking about the very, very high level independent counsels here, Jack Smith and Robert Hur. So I don't think that there's any reason for any of us to be vulnerable, to allow ourselves to acquiesce to all this hype in the media that is so completely, just politically driven. Let's wait and see what happens. In the meantime, an independent counsel and a grand jury chose this indictment.
Now, you say let's wait and see what happens. But before that, do you believe that the former president should be barred from running for public office?
The president has not been indicted. The president has been indicted, but the president has not been convicted. So right now, there is no reason for him to be barred from running for office.
Now, I also want to talk about the debt ceiling deal, which recently went through. On May 31st, you tweeted that the debt ceiling deal, quote, "sells out the American people and the planet on which we live." Now, President Biden has hailed the deal as an example of compromise. Why were you against the legislation?
First of all, I think that the 14th Amendment gives the president the right. This should not have even gotten to the point where it got. The full faith and credit of the United States must be protected. And if I had been the president, I don't think I would have been willing to negotiate with Kevin McCarthy on this. It's ridiculous. We should get rid of the whole thing. And the president and the Democrats should have done that. The entire debt ceiling issue should have been taken off the table when the Democrats had the power.
What would you have done differently other than try and get the law out of the way?
Well, I think the president could have invoked the 14th Amendment. He said that it would have been too held up in the courts, but that's a reason that Democrats particularly use a lot, rather than just going for what they want. And I just don't believe, whether it has to do with the debt ceiling or negotiations or anything else, that we should continue to sell out the poor and the middle class in this country for the sake of the people who have the most. For them to talk about their obstructionism, for them to talk about their disagreements with the president in terms of fiscal responsibility is somewhat absurd. For instance, they don't want to have the IRS agents that could raise billions of dollars just tracking down tax cheaters among the very, very rich. So it's all about protecting the rich at the expense of the poor. That's just what America has become far, far too often. And I have a strong objection to that. And that's why I'm running for president.
Now, we're going to get to your economic agenda in a little bit, but in your last statement, you criticized the Democratic Party a bit. I want to go into a bit of why you ran. Now, you have said that the president has a good heart. So I want to ask you, why try and unseat an incumbent in your own party?
I'm not thinking about party politics. I'm thinking about the state of America. And America is in trouble. The vast majority of Americans, and poll after poll show that this country is moving in the wrong direction. I agree with that. You have 70% of Americans who, according to a recent CNBC poll, say that they're living with constant economic anxiety. Now, the fact that we're not even talking about a public option, much less universal health care. 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. 18 million Americans cannot afford to pay for the prescriptions that their doctors give to them. Half of our seniors live on less than $25,000 a year. We have Americans rationing insulin. We have people who are just struggling to survive. We have a third of America's workforce who live on less than $15 an hour and cannot find a place to live in this country. So I'm running for president because we need an economic U-turn. The way I see the Republicans right now, I see it as kind of a nosedive for our democracy. But I see the corporatist Democrats, of which the president is one, is kind of a managed decline. Neither party, as it is currently, or as they are currently constituted, are addressing the deep regions of human suffering and despair that make up so much of the lives of the majority of American citizens. The Democrats are doing better than the Republicans, but that's just not enough anymore.
Now, there's also been a lot of talk about President Biden's age heading into his re-election bid. If inaugurated, he would be 82 in 2025, and if he finishes out his term, he would be 86. Do you think the president's age is an issue heading into the upcoming election?
One of the reasons I believe it's so important for the president to debate myself and his other opponent is so that the American people can more clearly make that decision for themselves. Let's see how he does in a debate. I think that's going to tell us a lot, because how he debates us will give you an indication how he's going to debate the 2024 challenger. The 2024 election will be different than the 2020 election, and the Democratic electorate should see very, very clearly how the president will perform.
Do you think he's competent enough to be president?
Well, those around him say that when it comes to the serious decision making, he's doing just fine. I think that's for every voter to decide for themselves. Obviously, I don't think he's our best choice for president for the next 4 years, or I wouldn't be running.
Now, let's talk about why you are running. If elected, what would be your number one goal as president?
It's interesting. I want to bring public policy in the United States back into alignment with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And that first principle also, which was articulated by Abraham Lincoln, when he said that we should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He said that the men who died at Gettysburg had died, given their last full measure of devotion, he said, so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. I'm running because it's perishing now. We are a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. I want to take us back to a government of the people. This is why I want the American people to have the same rights that they have in every other advanced democracy, such as universal health care, such as free or near free college tuition and tech school, free childcare, paid family leave, a guaranteed sick pay, and a guaranteed living wage. I don't think that the political system as it is now constituted is focused on or even acknowledging to a full extent the level of human suffering that is out there in this, the richest country in the world, simply because so many people are struggling to survive.
Now let's dive deeper into that. You've been a vocal critic of the distribution of wealth in America. What specific steps would you take as president to reduce what you see as a wealth inequality?
Well, first of all, the president doesn't have a magic wand, but the president has the bully pulpit, and the president has a lot of power to certainly express what she wants. So I can't come in and just make these things happen, but I can tell you what I would support. Number one, the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut gave 83 cents of every dollar to the largest, highest earners and corporations. That tax cut should be repealed. Immediately, we should put back in the middle class tax cut part of it, because that was a good idea. That's number one. Number two, we should have a wealth tax. People who who have assets of 50 million or more should pay an additional 2%. People who have $1 billion should pay 1%. We should also have all those tax cheats among the very, very richest. Definitely, we should have the IRS agents to do that. We should stop all these ridiculous corporate subsidies. We are subsidizing corporations that are already making billions of dollars. I also want to audit the Pentagon. We know, for instance, there was recent study that was that we all saw on 60 Minutes, there is well-established price gouging among defense contractors of the US military. They're basically left to regulate themselves at this point. This was not always true. So this idea that the $858 billion military budget is somehow keeping us safer is absolutely absurd, and more people see it. What we have is a matrix of corporate powers from insurance companies to pharmaceutical companies, big agriculture, big food, chemical companies, gun manufacturers, big oil and defense contractors. They are leeching this American civilization at this point. Policy after policy after policy has more to do with serving the goal of their own short-term profit maximization than the goal of safety, health, and well-being of the American people. That is the level of their undue financial influence on our politics. It has turned our government into a system of legalized bribery, and this needs to stop. And we need a president who is willing to say it like it is, and that's how your new season will begin.
So it's not one specific step, but multiple policies that you believe will translate to a better distribution of wealth in your view.
Well, yeah, of course, it's a whole systems breakdown that we've got here. We also, one of the first things I would do when you ask me what I would do is I will cancel the Willow Project. The Willow Project, which is an $8 billion ConocoPhillips oil extraction project up at the North Slopes of Alaska, nullify completely all of the investment in green energy that comes with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the president has given more oil drilling permits even than Trump did. This is not a time to be ramping up fossil fuel extraction. It's time to be ramping down fossil fuel extraction. I want a mass mobilization to provide a just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy. Literally, the fate of the human race could depend on this.
Now, let's talk about that further. A lot of supporters of former President Trump often cite President Biden's executive order canceling the construction of the Keystone Pipeline as a key factor in rising gas prices. You have said, and you just alluded to it, that you would halt all new fossil fuel projects. So how will you go about expanding the economy while advocating a clean, green energy agenda?
It doesn't expand the economy. Ultimately, if you're talking about an economy in which millions of people can hardly inhabit the planet, if we continue in the direction that we're going, there could be huge swaths of continents on this planet where the heat is so great that it is literally uninhabitable. When that's the case, you're going to have an implosion of food systems, an implosion of economies. You think we have situations now, whether in Europe or in the southern border of the United States, where you have massive refugees seeking a place to live? That is nothing compared to what will happen if we continue to heat this planet. Look at what happened with the Greek migrants the other day, the ship that sank, the Greek Coast Guard just standing there looking. We are in so many ways looking down the path into a future that could be so extraordinarily dangerous, painful, really horrifying, dystopian for our children and our grandchildren. We must be more mature and more responsible and more moral than to think of this only in terms of gas prices. We must think about this and the habitability of the planet for our children, our grandchildren, and their children as well.
There's a lot of people who are concerned with a rise in green energy that their jobs may be completely lost if they're working in the gas. What will you do to convince them?
You might remember that I said we need a just transition. You're absolutely right with what you said, and I'm very aware of that. Someone who's making over $100,000 working for an oil company who now says, what, you want me to go start working for $15 an hour installing solar panels? Hey, lady, no way. I do appreciate that. There are thousands of people in this country, many thousands of people, whose jobs are at least indirectly related to the fossil fuel extraction. These people must not fall through the crack. If I'm president, they will not fall through the crack. But I also remind you that there are many jobs, whether it has to do with technology, manufacturing, research, which we can make, where we can make a lateral transition. Because remember, we're not just talking about ramping down fossil fuel extraction, we're talking about ramping up all the incredible sources of green energy, wind, solar, geothermal, and all of those. So this is not about letting anybody fall through the cracks. This is about creating very good, high-paying jobs.
Now, what were you saying?
Well, that is what will happen with a serious intention and mobilization in the direction of a shift to a green energy grid.
Now you do talk about that just transition. What will that transition look like? Are you talking like a 20, 30-year timeline? Are you talking a 5-year, infrastructure plan? What are we talking about?
First of all, my first job, one of the things that I'm fascinated by, we were talking before about former presidents. Roosevelt knew that he wasn't going to be able to take us into war, World War II. He wasn't going to be able to achieve what he knew needed to be achieved at that time until he had a real buy-in, a real enrollment on the part of the American people. And that is my first order of business, to seek to harness the enthusiasm of the American people, the real buy-in of the American people that, yes, we're going to do this because we need to. At the beginning of World War II, we didn't have a standing army, and neither did England. Right? You and I were talking before about Normandy. Hitler, however, had been working for 5 years building up his military, and every time he invaded a country, he absorbed their industry. We had nothing, but we made it happen. And that is what we are going to do. Can I tell you exactly how many years it will take to get to this marker or that marker? No, I can't. But I will tell you this. Once the American people understand why we need to do it, once the American people are led in such a way as to enthusiastically know that we can do it, then we will be able to move much more quickly than it has been predicted. And why? Because the Arctic shelves are moving. The things that we are most concerned about are happening much more quickly than we feared. And now we have to behave and act far more quickly than we had even thought was possible. And we can.
Now, you talk about forgiving student loans, you talk about universal health care, you talk about more of a green energy transition. These are a lot of platforms that are similar to someone you supported back in 2020, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. But here's the reality. In 2016, Bernie did not end up winning the nomination, and in 2020, Senator Sanders actually amassed fewer delegates the second time around. Do you think that message, one that's similar to your own, resonates with voters today?
Well, if you look at poll after poll, the will of the people is not the problem in this country. In poll after poll, Americans are a little bit left of center. Americans want universal health care. The American people, the majority of American people make it clear, even among Republicans, they want universal health care. The American people want more robust efforts at mitigating climate change. The problem is not the voters. The problem is that we have a sclerotic political system in the grip of huge corporate entities, and there are financial overreach, which actually obstructs, which does more to thwart than to facilitate the expression of the will of the people. So yeah, absolutely. Do I think the voters, if given the clear choice before them, would respond to what I'm saying? Clearly they would. The problem we have is all the institutional resistance in this country to their even having a chance to hear those agendas.
What would you say to the currently struggling American who does not think reinventing the system is the answer, though?
Do you think that the American who is struggling thinks that the system is working for them? The American that you're talking about who is struggling, 1 in 4 of whom have a medical debt, many of whom are rationing their insulin, 68,000 of whom a year are dying from lack of health care, 18 million of whom cannot afford to pay the prescriptions that their doctors give them, millions of whom have to work at more than one job in order to feed their children. You think they think the system is working for them? The American people are not stupid. During the 1970s, the average American worker could afford a car, could afford a house, could afford a yearly vacation. One parent could stay home with the kids if they wanted to, and they could afford to send their kids to college. That was in the 1970s. That was a thriving middle class. That was when the system was working for them. It is not working for that struggling person now. It is working for a billionaire class. It is working for 1% of Americans. Now, this is the way it is. If you are among the top 20% of financial advantage in this country, it's great. But 20%, 20% in the richest country in the world. So that 20% are living on an island surrounded by a vast sea of economic despair. No, the average struggling American is not under the illusion that the system is working for them. More and more Americans, millions of Americans, feel completely left behind by Washington because they have been.
Now, moving on a bit from the economy, it was recently reported and corroborated by multiple sources that your second campaign manager in 2 months stepped down. What would you say to voters who are concerned about that level of turnover and whether it will translate to a Williamson administration?
You know, when you are tried in a court of law, you have your own counsel who gets to cross-examine the witnesses and establish the facts. And a judge will throw out facts that are not true. These are rules of due process. When you are attacked in the press, when you are attacked in the media, when you are, attacked in a court of public opinion, anybody can say anything. They have no idea what happened with my staff. I invite you to come talk to my staff. I have a wonderful team, and the stories that have been promulgated are simply, there's a line from an old Simon and Garfunkel song. I would not be convicted by a jury of my peers. So the stories about those two that you mentioned are, I assure you, not what they appear to be.
You've also been accused of creating a toxic work environment. What do you say to those accusations?
Yeah, it's funny, they say that about Kamala too, don't they? And they say that about Amy, and it's interesting how many women get that accusation. What men have been accused of such things? I don't really remember. And I'll tell you something, when men candidates
Former President Trump was accused of a high staff turnover.
well, he's such an outlier on anything. But look, I can be tough. I can be tough, but I'm not the person that has been described in the press. I have raised my voice at times in ways that I regret, and I'm sorry. But the stories that I think one of them said I threw a phone or something, absolutely not. If anybody feels that, I don't know. I'm not the person that has been described, but I can be tough at times. But on the other hand, I'm running for president.
Now, it's tomorrow from the day we're recording this is going to be the 1-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, which of course overturned Roe versus Wade. You have said that you would try and codify Roe versus Wade into law. How would you go about convincing individuals who are more pro-life, especially in the modern political system, into enacting such a measure?
Well, first of all, the Democrats should have codified it when they had the chance. Right now, if I become president and I have a split Congress, I will not be able to do that. If I have a House and a Senate, then even if you need to, you should get rid of the filibuster and codify those rights. Everything that we were warning would happen is already happening. Terrible things with women who have terrible medical conditions. The doctor's hands are tied. They're not able to perform the procedures that they need to in order to save these women and their own health. Terrible things are already happening. Look, I think that abortion is a moral decision, but it is a private moral decision. And I don't think the government should have anything to do with that decision making. And that's how I feel about it. And I feel that a woman's right to make her own reproductive decisions should be sacrosanct. And the idea of government getting in there and making these decisions about a woman's body is profound government overreach.
Do you think the Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy?
They have with me.
Would you try and increase the number of seats on the court currently?
I would not rule it out. There's nothing in the Constitution that says how many people are on the Supreme Court or should be on the Supreme Court.
Now, I also want to ask you about a platform that's, I don't know if I'd call it truly unique to you, but it certainly stands out. You're a strong proponent of animal protection. What made the topic so resonant for you?
Moving to Iowa, the CAFOs. I was not aware, I was not viscerally aware of what animal cruelty and what animal factory farming meant until I moved to Iowa. I knew intellectually, I had read articles, but I came up close, up close and personal. And then in California as well. I don't think the average American is registering the level of animal cruelty that is involved in animal factory farming. And I say that, you know how some people are just obsessed with animals? I'm not overly obsessed with animals. I have an average human sense of responsibility to steward the planet well, including care for the animals. But what is going on with animal factory farming, the level of cruelty, it is absolutely unnatural. And I don't believe that as human beings, we should be acting this way.
What would you do to alleviate it?
There are ways to have safe and humane animal rights protected in a way that does not include the extreme level of cruelty that animal factory farming does represent.
Like what?
You know, we did it years ago. This animal factory farming, the way it is now practiced, is something that is a modern phenomenon. It has only occurred, it has only grown over the last few decades. This is what happens when companies become so concerned with could we make more money? Could we make more money? Rather than any ethical consideration for people, for animals, for children, for the planet. And this is why you need to be guardrails. There need to be guardrails, and this is why there need to be ethics. People can make money. People can create a profit, people can produce and be creative without a level of cruelty to animals or to people. It's simply unacceptable.
Now, we've talked a lot about domestic policy. Let's go over foreign policy. What, in your opinion, is the biggest foreign policy threat to the United States and why?
I think the biggest foreign policy threat is that we are recklessly thinking in oppositional terms. You know, the United States, I believe that we should have a United States Department of Peace. I think that when we talk about national security, as you and I were already discussing, an $858 billion military budget does not, in my mind, translate into national security. We have been hearing for decades that our military was all about protecting America's national interests, and we have come to recognize how often that was poppycock. The Iraq War did not increase our security in the world. 20 years too long and a spectacular failure in Afghanistan did not increase our security in the world. I don't believe that the 750 military installations spread over 800 countries protects our national security interests. I think that we have squandered our moral authority. I think we have squandered our military authority to the point where the world is not so scared anymore when the United States says you better do what we say or we might do something. People are like, ooh, I'm scared. All of the money that we spent, the trillions of dollars, not to mention the blood of our own soldiers and the blood of people in other parts of the world, it should not have been at the effect of this military madness. And for what? If anything, we have made ourselves more vulnerable. If anything, we have made other countries more eager to criticize us and to be open to deals with China, to other whether it's Russia, whether it's China. Look what's happening with BRICS. Look what's happening with China, with Russia, with Brazil, with India. It is now a multipolar world. It is not a unipolar world. And the United States needs to become more humble in our public policy and in our foreign policy. And as president, I would work at the levels of collaboration that are necessary now when it comes to nuclear, when it comes to AI, and when it comes to climate. These are three areas which represent a threat to this country and to the possible future of the planet. So great that we absolutely must learn ways to collaborate with people whom otherwise we might be fighting with. We simply cannot make the military or military posture the leading edge of our foreign policy. It simply has to stop.
Now, it's interesting. A lot of your opponents will mention either China or Russia as the biggest foreign policy threat, and you're not.
Well, I'm not naive about the dangers that loom. And I do believe, this is how I look at the U.S. military. I look at the U.S. military like I look at a surgeon. If the U.S. has to have surgery, then you better believe we must have the best surgeon. But a reasonable person tries to avoid surgery if at all possible. This is why I want a Department of Peace. This is why I want, just as Donald Rumsfeld of all people said, we must learn to wage peace. We must learn to increase the factors that statistically lead to a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. Having said that, when we must act and we must be firm, then absolutely we must act and we must be firm. That is to recognize that the imperialistic adventure of Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. And I do support the sovereignty of Ukraine. Sometimes we have to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Now, you've mentioned your desire, and you allude to it, to reduce the defense budget. You've specifically been quoted as saying 30%. You've also been quoted in a Council on Foreign Relations interview as saying that the greatest foreign policy mistake the United States committed since World War II is nuclear escalation. I want to ask you, what are your...
I don't think I specifically did.
You specifically said that in the interview.
I'm very concerned about it.
Nuclear escalation.
7,000 nuclear bombs in our own arsenal that we even know of, and we continue to escalate, and I think it's a terrible idea. When I was younger, we actually protested, banned the bomb. We need to be thinking in terms of nuclear de-escalation. We need to be thinking in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, probably right now more critically than at any other time in our history.
What are your overall thoughts on the nuclear arsenal? Do you think it should be used to initiate a strike against an adversary if you need to?
I would work every waking hour to create a world in which that question was not even posed to me. And I will tell you this, 7,000 nuclear bombs does not make the United States safer. A small portion of those dropped anywhere in the world, and the planet could become uninhabitable for 200 to 300,000 years. This is not about making the world safer. We make the world safer by building up the kind of diplomatic and humanitarian efforts that will increase our ability to collaborate with other people. That doesn't mean we're naive about the military advances of any country that might represent a threat to the United States. But the way we're talking about things now, the paths that we are on now, using the idea of military and military presence as the leading edge in our foreign policy is absolutely unacceptable. It has not made the world safer. It has not made us safer. And under my presidency, we would turn this around.
Now, I do want to ask about the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Would you support additional arms sales if elected president to Ukraine?
One of the things that I have supported President Biden on in this issue is he said he's not allowing President Zelensky to make the determination of what the United States does to support them. It is our own military analysis that does this. We are in the middle of a counteroffensive right now. I wish them well. And we cannot be giving a blank check. Clearly, this has to be a negotiated settlement, but I prefer, of course, that it be a negotiated settlement in which there is still a Ukraine. So to whatever extent we can support them in creating a situation where whatever negotiated settlement is achieved, they still have their national sovereignty, that would be my wish. On the other hand, obviously, it cannot be a blank check. This cannot go on forever.
Now, I do want to ask you about gun policy. There's been over 250 mass shootings this year alone in the United States. And a recent Pew survey from last year found that 32% of K-12 parents were either very or extremely concerned about a shooting happening at their child's school. What would you do to reduce the number of mass shootings in America and restore confidence in school safety?
Well, of course, I would do everything possible to pass an assault weapon ban. During the 10 years that we did have an assault weapon ban, the number of mass shootings was greatly reduced. Everything that the president can do, whether it has to do with high capacity magazines or anything else, federal red flag laws and so forth. I am for the most strident measures of common sense gun safety laws that are possible and that are allowed within the purview, of course, of the Second Amendment. But I also recognize that we need to get beyond the argument, is it culture or is it guns? Because clearly it's both. And I call on the American people to tamp down the violence, not only on our streets, but in our hearts. There's a mean-spiritedness in America today. There's a quickness to attack, and emotional violence is violence. Psychological violence is violence. Gratuitous sex and violence that's in our movies, in our television. We have young children watching on primetime television while people are murdered in the most heinous ways. It's one thing if you have a great filmmaker like a Martin Scorsese, where the use of violence is so clearly not gratuitous. But when you're talking about video games and you're talking about some of the television shows and movies being made now, do I think there should be laws against them? Of course not. But all Americans are going to have to participate in looking in our hearts. What are we doing? The Twitter is violent. Social media is violent. What are we doing? You know, Martin Luther King said, we must have a quantitative shift in our circumstances and a qualitative shift in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our circumstances. There has to be a both and effort made. We will be a violent society until we choose to become a nonviolent one. And I hope that I can convince enough American people that this is the road we need to take.
Now, before we end off here, I do want to ask you about AI, which you briefly mentioned earlier. Here on Long Island, AI is being used all the time. Some hospitals are even using it to assess patient risks. What are your thoughts overall on AI? And do you think we should boost more funding for it?
Oh, not boost more funding for it. We need to boost more regulation. I'm terrified. This thing is outpacing us on levels that none of us expected. It's moving way too fast, becoming way too powerful, way too fast. So at this point, whereas a few years ago, the conversation was, ooh, could it possibly take our jobs away? At this point, it's a much bigger question than that. We have now seen examples already where it's this phenomena they call the hallucination on the part of the AI. And I agree with Naomi Klein, who recently wrote an article who said, when she said, we're hallucinating if we think that this thing could not be very, very dangerous. So I'm all for, this is one of the areas where I said before, this is where governments need to be collaborating in creating a world where these things could not possibly get control of us, because we're kidding ourselves if we think that they couldn't.
Do you think there's like a red line that can't be crossed in regards to AI?
Well, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, if you ask some of these machines, you know, I read some article about some machine that was asked, could you enslave the human race? Could you take over the human race? And the answer was, well, we're not there yet, but we're getting there. I mean, this is what the AI response was. None of us should be kidding ourselves. This is this to me should be seen as serious at this point as nuclear bombs themselves.
Would you support a robot tax?
Would I support a what?
Robot tax.
Robot tax. I've never even heard of a robot tax. This is
if companies replace their employees, their human employees, with a robot to do the same or relatively similar tasks, would you support a tax on that business as a result of not paying their employees a salary?
Well, I can tell you that this is the first time I've ever heard of it, but just hearing about it, just as you described it, it's certainly something I would look at.
What would be your lasting message to voters ahead of the primary season?
This is a very dangerous time in the United States. We are in an era of decline, and it is our responsibility as citizens to lift us up, to spiral up at a time when so many of our societal and economic and political circumstances are spiraling down. In order to do this, incremental change is simply not enough. We are already 6 inches from the cliff in terms of the state of our environment, in terms of the state of our democracy, and in terms of the state of our economy. I reject the notion that only people whose careers have been entrenched for years in the car that drove us into this ditch are the only ones who should be considered qualified to lead us out of it. The current political and economic status quo will not disrupt itself. It will take someone from outside the system who chooses to do that, but not someone from outside the system who represents an even greater alliance with an unfettered capitalist corporate machinery, but someone who recognizes that this country should belong to its people. Franklin Roosevelt said that the most important job of the presidency was not administrative, but moral leadership. We don't just need more technocrats in Washington. We have plenty of good political car mechanics, but the problem is we're on the wrong road. We need a visionary. And I believe that of all the people running, I'm the one to fit that bill.
Author and Democratic candidate for President of the United States, Marianne Williamson. Marianne, thank you so much for being here with me today. And once again, congratulations on becoming a grandmother.
Thank you very, very much.